welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. And last, but certainly not least, if you're interested in extra content on querying and publishing that's only for our members, please consider joining the Literary Prospects Patreon at patreon.com/literary prospects. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Karen Thompson Walker is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, The Age of Miracles, which has been translated into 27 languages and named one of the best books of the year by People, the Oprah Magazine, and Financial Times, among others. Her second novel, The Dreamers, was a New York Times Book Review editor's choice and was named one of the best books of the year by Glamour, Real Simple, and Good Housekeeping. Her third novel, The Strange Case of Jane O, is out now. Born and raised in San Diego, Karen is a graduate of UCLA and the Columbia MFA program. She lives with her husband, the novelist Casey Walker, and their two daughters in Portland, where she's an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Oregon. Karen Thompson Walker, thank you so much for being here to discuss your spellbinding new novel, The Strange Case of Jane O. The New York Times says The Strange Case of Jane O is quiet, cool-toned. Scenes vibrate with the high-key hopes and anxieties of adolescence, the inherent loneliness of being a person in the world. People says a mesmerizing tale about the mysteries of the brain, the limits of rationality, and the magic of love. Book Page says engrossing, sculpting a novel that conveys vastness through inner lives alone is a tremendous challenge. Making that same novel a page-turning mystery that's simultaneously moving and often nail-biting is another challenge altogether. With The Strange Case of Jane O, Karen Thompson Walker rises to meet both of these challenges head-on and succeeds. Author Karen Russell says a brilliant and unforgettable novel, at once a metaphysical thriller, a psychological mystery, and a profound love story, a book for every haunted heart. And one more. There are so many great ones of these. We'll do one more. And author Angie Kim says an astonishing novel, a mind-blowing blend of page-turning mystery and deep philosophical inquiry into the nature of memory and reality itself. Karen Thompson Walker has created an unputdownable book with a haunting twist ending I'll be thinking about for a long time. I'm in awe. So with that, what can you tell us about The Strange Case of Jane O? How do you describe the book?
Yeah, I like that question. I mean, I like to think of it as kind of one part literary novel, one part speculative mystery about memory, motherhood, identity, and love. And yeah, it's the story of this woman, Jane O, who is suddenly struck by these really eerie and unsettling psychological symptoms. So sudden hallucinations, memory lapses, and a kind of increasingly creepy sense of dread.
What was the spark that started this one for you?
Yeah, it actually, I got the idea when I was still working on my last novel, The Dreamers. I was sort of toward the end of that book, and I was doing a little kind of late research related to sleep and consciousness. And for that reason, I went back to a favorite author of mine, the neurologist Oliver Sacks. So I was looking back at a couple of his books. He wrote these really beautiful and profound case histories of real people living with extraordinary and uncanny brain disorders. So I was rereading some of those case histories, looking for like specific information about sort of strange sleep details or
Mhm.
consciousness, ideas about consciousness for my last book. When I just sort of involuntarily got this idea of like, what if I wrote a whole novel that imagined what if a doctor who was maybe a little like Oliver Sacks, or at least with a similar type of specialty, what if he encountered a patient whose symptoms were so extraordinary that they really couldn't be explained by any of the usual causes? And what if they seemed to him in some way impossible?
Wow. I want to talk about the mystery element of the book a little bit. We heard in the blurbs, you've done two really difficult things in this novel simultaneously. You've created this vast world and story that's all told through a psychologist's notes on a patient and letters that Jane, the patient, is writing to her infant son. And also, you've structured in such a way that as the reader, we get this really satisfying, gripping, tense mystery. So, how did you do that? Did you know from the beginning that you were going to structure this as a mystery in this way, sort of doling out the
Yeah,
details?
I guess because from that initial kernel, yeah, I always knew I wanted it to feel, I mean, it's not a mystery like, I don't know, capital M mystery,
Mm-hmm.
but it has this like, hopefully a mystery like quality to the reading experience, as
Mm-hmm.
you said.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that that would be the thing that was the engine of the book, like what's really going on with this woman and what's behind all these strange symptoms. But when I got that initial kernel, I wrote a pretty close version of what the opening scene is, sort of within a day or so of reading, getting that
Wow.
idea that I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier. So I just imagined a woman walking into a psychiatrist's office, seeming kind of nervous, distressed, but who refuses to say what's wrong. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I wrote that without actually knowing or having imagined exactly what her situation was or what was behind it or even what all her symptoms were. I just knew I wanted her to be like this mysterious person who walks in and then leaves quickly before the psychiatrist can make much sense of her case. So I knew that because I had that initial jumping off point, and the thing that was driving my interest as a writer and that I hoped would drive the reader's interest would be, you know, just the answer to the question of what is going on with her.
Yeah. How did you make the decision to also do the two points of view and in this particular way, especially with Jane's notes to her son, which works so beautifully?
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you. Yeah, I actually, because it started so much with this idea about Oliver Sacks and the way that he um, wrote so beautifully about and kind of empathetically about these unusual people who walked into his office. I was so yeah, enchanted with that idea that at first I actually thought this whole book, I'd write the whole book from the perspective of the psychiatrist, like would just only be like his case history in a way of this strange patient. But I like pretty early on, once I started actually writing the book, I realized like that felt really wrong and incomplete. I was like, if the story is about this thing that's happening to this woman, Jane, like I, we need to hear her voice. Like eventually we need to hear it from her directly, what she's experiencing. So that I think once I figured that out, I decided it would alternate in some way the perspectives. So once I figured that out, that was like the key to the real experience of or the real process of writing the whole book. It went from like that initial kernel to like a vision of how the whole book could work. And I also got really interested once I realized I would have two narrators. I got really interested in the possibilities for storytelling when each is telling like an overlapping but differing you know they're speaking from a different point of view and also like
Mhm.
about slightly different things, and sometimes often they match up, but sometimes there's some space, and that was part of the fun of writing the book, and I tried to make use of that in the storytelling, that kind of uncertainty.
What is your process like? And maybe it's different for each book, but when you're getting your initial idea, what happens next? How do you go from this seed of an idea to your finished piece?
Yeah, I mean, I do. One thing I love about writing novels is like each one feels a little different, and
Hmm.
the experience of the process is a little different. But I think what is the way that it has worked for me, all three of my books, is that I get this initial idea for a kind of a situation or a premise, and then and some characters, um, and then I write pretty much in order so that I hopefully am in touch with the sequence that the reader will read the story in. You know, at the beginning, I
Uh-huh.
am yeah, I'm right where the reader is. Like I don't know what's going on with Jane, and then we move through as I move through the story. Um, like I'm figuring things out sort of at a similar rate that the reader is figuring it
Hmm.
out. With this one, something that was different is because it was a mystery. I found I had to go back much more than with my other books because it
Hmm.
wasn't just a chronological telling of a story. It was also about like figuring out the mystery and events that had happened earlier.
Hmm.
Um, so that was different. I had to go back and like change the logic of some earlier scenes to make sure that the later part lined up.
Hmm. Hmm. You say, speaking of chronology, you say that time is one of your obsessions. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that manifests in your work?
um, yeah, sorry. Now my neighbor is doing something very loud at their house. Are you hearing like
I don't hear it.
some kind of landscape? Okay, good, good. Sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
Time, yeah. So you asked me to talk about what interests me so much about time, and I don't, I think it's a little intuitive, but I think it's just something that I love in general to write about and to read about are these parts of human experience where um, something really ordinary overlaps with the extraordinary, like something that seems everyday and ordinary, but actually has this kind of mysterious underpinning that we're not always aware of.
Hmm.
So, like sleep is an example, or consciousness in general. You know, we all live in consciousness, but yet there's a lot that's still mysterious, even to scientists, about how consciousness functions. So,
Yeah.
in that same way, time, I feel like obviously we all live in time. We're like looking at our watch, or like we're 10 minutes late to a meeting or whatever. There's this like everydayness to our
Hmm.
experience of time. But on the other hand, there is something really deeply mysterious about it, which is maybe partly revealed by like physics and cosmology, like knowing that we are in this universe where time is like almost infinite and that we don't know. There's huge gaps in our understanding, and just the idea that like the theory of relativity, that it passes at different rates, literally, depending on the situation, but then also emotionally, obviously, we all understand that time. Time can seem to pass at different rates depending on the situation. Like that
Hmm.
in a traumatic moment can seem very slow, like slow down as our brain takes in so much information, and then or if we're bored or whatever. Anyway, just that feeling of flexibility, like, is very fascinating to me. And just kind of on some level unknowability is very fascinating to me. But it also is so familiar that we're all living in it. So I think that's maybe like a long way around to why I'm fascinated with it. But then I am also specifically fascinated with like the ways on a kind of imaginative level, the ways that qu- quantum physics starts to mess with. If you read about it, which I am no expert, but the more I read about that kind of stuff, the more fascinated I am with the idea that like just in general reality and as it relates to time might not be exactly as it seems to us humans.
Yes. I think about that too, and it always just blows my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I like reading about that stuff because not because I can fully capture it, but almost just the experience of having my mind blown is like a
Yes.
pleasure in itself. Uh,
Yes. Well, speaking of having your mind blown, um, your novels are all grounded in our world as we know it, but sort of, just one thing a little off kilter, as you said, where
right.
the extraordinary and ordinary kind of overlap. I would assume that writing in that space requires a fair amount of research, as you've already alluded to. What is your research process like? And what was it for Jane O?
Yeah, I think with every book, I think I've done more research than the last. Like, I think the research has started to become like a part of the pleasure of writing for me.
Mm.
Just to have a subject, like a new subject that I can spend a few years immersing myself in, has been part of the pleasure. But so for this one, for Jane O, I mean, um, the main research that I was doing was on all about psychiatry, psychology, neurology, how memory functions, how psychotherapy is conducted. And that's because even though the book it takes a kind of speculative, has an ultimately speculative direction,
Mhm.
I really wanted the psychiatrist's voice to be credible as a real expert.
Mhm.
So yeah, making sure that felt realistic was one of the biggest challenges of the book. And I just did a ton. I mean, my research process is reading. Like, I know some people will do like interviews, but I
Mm.
just tried to read as many books as I could by psychotherapists, by neurologists, by patients, and just kind of gradually started to get a sense of, yeah, how a psychiatrist like this might think about the strange symptoms that Jane presents with. But there
Mhm.
was, I read a lot of it was like for a general audience, but some of it I read some, like I would often refer to the DSM or like other kinds of tools that are aimed at psychiatrists.
Do you tend to do a big block of research when you're starting out with a new idea and then start writing, or is it all kind of intertwined together?
I think that's a really good question, and I think different writers do it in different ways. For
Mhm.
me, it's very intertwined. Like I
Mm.
mean, I I got the idea. I mean, in a way, I got the idea from reading and from research.
Mhm.
I got the idea from Oliver Sacks. And then when I really sat down to write it, I was like, wow, I need to read a lot more about, like, to really understand how the psychiatrist is going to speak. I need to read a lot more about psychiatry. So that
Mhm.
was step one. I started reading, but I was writing at the same time. And then, yeah, so the whole time, really, I was writing the events of the story and his voice, but kind of continually reading. The reading would, like, I would get a new idea to add some detail to something I'd written last week or whatever. It was on an ongoing process. And then occasionally I got to a moment where I was like, but really, what what are the symptoms of a certain disorder? And then I would have to look that
Mhm.
up. But most of it was more like an ongoing process of, I was just always reading a book about yeah, psychiatry, neurology, memory, all the time. There was always one going, and then I was just trying to use what I learned along the way. Yeah.
Am I correct in saying that Jane O is the first novel that you've published since having kids?
No, but it's the first, I guess. Yeah, no, I mean,
The
so
Dreamers would have been the
yes, the
okay.
dream. So my first novel, The Age of Miracles, I had no kids. Then
Hmm.
I had two babies
Hmm.
in The Age of Miracles and The Dreamers. Uh,
Hmm.
I
Okay.
mean, this is the first one that I've written the entire thing with two children living in my house. So it does feel like a mark in some way. Um, yeah.
Do you feel like being a mother has changed the way that you approach your work at all?
Yes. I mean, it's for sure just on a practical level, definitely
Right.
changed it radically, because I used to love, and I probably would still love to write first thing in the morning, like just right when I wake up. Like when I wrote The Age of Miracles, like wake up, make some coffee, and write for an hour, or whatever.
Mhm.
That's how I worked. And now, I mean, maybe if my kids were late sleepers, I still would do that. But one of them wakes up very early and always has. Now she's 10. So it's like for 10 years, I haven't really been able to do that version. So, yeah. So just on a practical level, I've had to adapt. But I think, and I have just generally less time. But it has been interesting to see, um, you know, parenthood and the development of young children kind of
Mm.
make it into the like actual stories that I'm writing, you know.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
never would have written, I mean, that happened with The Dreamers. And then in Jane O, I guess something maybe we haven't talked so much about here yet is that both of these main characters are the parents of young children, and they're raising them on their own. So
Mhm.
Dr. Bird has a 3-year old, and Jane has a baby. And so all that material and knowing yeah, just what it feels like to be a new parent, especially and a parent of
Mhm.
young children, um, the worry and the disruption. And I think for Jane, it's also that so for her to have her own like mental health crisis and be going through these strange events while also trying to raise her, I mean, try to take care of her baby. There's like an extra
Mhm.
set of an extra source of tension around that I never probably would have come to if I had written this before I had kids.
And that's an interesting point that you make. They are both single parents raising children on their own, our two main characters. What was it particularly about that single parent space that drew you to writing about it as well?
Um, yeah, I don't, I am not a single parent. I guess I feel so it's not, it wasn't exactly like, even though there's an autobiographical element of just what it's like to be a parent of a young
Yeah.
child. I don't know what it would be like to do it all on my own. But maybe there's just something about like for the book, there was something about the magnification. Like it's just so
Oh.
intense to have young children and to be in charge of their well-being all the time as part of a couple. It's still really
Hmm.
intense. And
Hmm.
so the idea of someone of doing it on your own, which obviously many people are in real life doing on their own, there was something that really magnified, I guess, like for the purposes of the book, it seemed to magnify some of the things I was interested in looking at, like just
Yeah.
what how much life changes, especially for Jane, because she's a new parent so there's this feeling that maybe has the experience of being a new parent, a new mother triggered, like one of the questions is, has it triggered
Hmm.
these strange symptoms? So yeah, I guess I just felt like there was this magnification of the issues I was interested in. I mean, and then both of these characters, and maybe especially Jane, are also, their personalities are that they're like kind of on the outside of things socially a bit. They're a bit
Hmm.
isolated and introverted, so that's also a part of their they don't have like, neither one of them has like a big network of friends and family who are helping them all the time. So I guess, yeah, it was an extension of their personalities too.
You're known for the speculative element you add to your work, but also regarded for your literary style, this wonderful controlled voice and storytelling. So I'm wondering, how did the voices of your narrators come to you? We talked about, through your reading, I guess some, but do you tend to hear the voice of your narrators all at once in your head, or are they kind of excavated more on the page
Oh, I
through?
love that word, excavated. That's a really good analogy to what it feels like, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I need to start writing a book. I need the voice. Like I need to know
Mhm.
what the voice is to progress. So that I had a version of especially Dr. Bird's voice right away, a version of it. But there is, like you said, yeah, an excavation process. Like especially in the beginning, the first like first, I don't know, 10 or 20 pages, I start to like get a sense of how the voice is going to sound, and then it's like kind of permanent in my mind of like I know how he would say a thing, after that. But yeah, but Jane's was a little found it to be a little slower process to figure out exactly how she would
Mm.
speak, and actually a late I initially thought that she would be writing just journal entries, um straightforward journal entries,
Mhm.
but I felt like there was something and I that is how I wrote it, in a relatively late draft. That's how it was, but there was something a little like loose about it, like a little too much, like maybe a little too much like a regular journal entry, and it
Mhm.
felt, yeah, like I wanted a tighter feeling. Um, and my husband was actually the one who suggested that I have her sections be letters to her 1 year old son. And I remember when he first gave me that idea, I was like, "What?" It felt really alien for a minute, but then by the next day, I was like, "Yes, that is what I want to. I want to try it." And I think suddenly by doing that, like if she's writing not just general reflective journal entries, but kind of more like urgent information that she wants to transmit to an imagined version of her son when he's old enough to read it. Like there
Yeah.
was something about that that just gave it a new charge. And so I cut a lot of things that I was like, she wouldn't be mentioning this to her imagined version of her 1 year old son. It really just like cinched it up and gave it this new emotional charge that was really exciting to me. And I think maybe it also felt natural. Like I was so grateful that my husband, who is a writer too, suggested it. But I
Mhm.
think another reason that it really worked is that I actually do keep, or especially before, when my children were younger, I kept a document that was um, written to that, like it says
Oh,
like
wow.
dear Penny, dear Hazel, and it's like, today you said this, or like you did this funny thing, and I did do that, especially when they were really young.
Mhm.
During the times that I knew they would never remember those things, I had this urge to like document it for them. So I think I tapped a little, even though those letters are not stories about a crisis. I think I
Mhm.
tapped into that a little, like just there is something so enchanting about writing to the imagined version of your child as an adult,
Yeah.
So anyway, I think so. Yeah, that's how that part came to be.
Oh, that's really great. And it does work so beautifully. And it does add that really raw emotional charge when you're reading it to hear her imagining this version of her son in the future that she hopes is there,
Yeah,
you
that's
know.
great. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and I noticed right away that when it was just journal entries, if she would kind of mention how difficult this transition has been, or how little time she has, how hard it is to be the mother of a young child. If it's just in her journals, that's one thing. But now suddenly it was speaking to her son. Like so there was this element of like guilt that was new
Yes.
and interesting to me. Like she would be like, oh shit, I cannot, kind of feels bad saying it, but wants to tell the truth. Anyway, so yeah. So I'm glad that I hope it feels like it added a dimension.
Yes. Yes, it definitely did. Jane O also takes place in New York, where you used to live. You no longer live here. Now you're in Portland, Oregon. And you have said that you find you can only write about a place after you leave it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, so far that's how it has felt. And I mean, I think it's been an intuitive thing. It's like I sort of realized it later. I mean, I noticed it with my first book, The Age of Miracles. I I started writing. I mean, I wrote that as a short story first, but I never really thought to write about life in California where I grew up until I
Mm,
was living in New York because it was suddenly so the contrast was so sharp to me when I was
mhm,
living in New York. So just like my memories of all these ordinary things about life in especially like suburban Southern California, they suddenly seemed so vibrant to me in
mhm,
memory and in contrast to what my daily life was. Um, and then I noted, so I knew that that happened with that book, and then um, I wrote another one. The Dreamers was also set in
mhm,
California while I was mostly living in New York. And then this one, yeah, I noticed. I mean, I did write the initial kernel of the woman walking into the office when I was still living in Brooklyn.
mhm.
Um, so I don't know why in that moment I didn't choose California, but I saw it in New York. But then almost that, I wrote like so maybe 5 pages while I was in New York, and then I moved to Oregon to take a job teaching at creative writing at the University of Oregon. And then I wrote the whole rest of this New York book from Oregon, and I had the same experience of feeling like all the things that I had gotten used to about daily life in New York City now had this like vibrancy in memory again, and it was easier for me to tell like what were the interesting things or what was worth including. Yeah, so I don't know, so maybe it's something about, I guess I've just started to think that there's something about memory for all of us that is kind of related to imagination. It's
Mhm,
like
mhm.
it's something, there's something almost not maybe not intentionally artistic, but it is sort of this weird like involuntary artistic process that
Yeah.
makes a memory like
Uh-huh.
so yeah, I think there's something, I don't, it's a little intuitive, but I think there is something about that is useful to me as a writer.
The
um
juxtaposition within your brain of the two places next to each other.
Yes,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
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 And
That
I think it
makes
does require to like I think it does sort of to call up a memory of a place. It feels almost like it, it does sort of feel like it's your imagination is in some way tapped in. Not creating something
uh-huh.
new really, but like I don't know, something about it feels very similar.
Yes. Yeah. It's colored by your own experience and what you
Right.
remember, and you are calling it forth from non-reality, right?
Yes. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you come to writing?
Oh, well, I loved I loved reading and writing as a child. I think the first when I was in elementary school, I started to do a bit of writing and felt like it did feel like, oh, this is like I like this. Like
Mhm.
it felt like it came to me as a thing that I like and that was maybe had some kind of talent for as a kid. So I guess it started then. Um, and in particular, I loved um, like I liked writing stories that had some kind of like fantastical element. So there
Mm,
was something similar. I mean, yeah, there was to what I'm interested in now, and I love the work of as a reader, the work of Roald Dahl,
mm,
like the witches and the
mm,
BFG, and those have obviously these magical elements. And then I guess when I went to college, I think I thought I would do something more practical, a type of writing that'd be more practical, like, or what I thought, journalism or like, I don't know, PR or something. I don't know.
mm.
But I really fell in love with creative writing classes at UCLA. I studied with Mona Simpson and Amy Bender there. And
Oh.
yeah, I think that's when I fell in love with the like, I don't know, the real like adult professional version of writing. And it was
Mm.
kind of like a restart of something or a reminder of something that I had loved as a child. Um, so yeah, so that was like a second beginning, I guess. Mhm.
And before you published your first novel, Age of Miracles, you worked as a book editor at
That's
Simon
right.
and Schuster, right?
Right.
How do you think that that experience of working as an editor um, colors your work as an author?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think especially for my first book, and then those are skills I've carried with me. I think there was just like I also went to graduate school. That's how I ended up in New York. I went to graduate school at Columbia, and then I was writing short stories. And I remember feeling like I could not imagine writing a book length story. Like I mean, like a novel. It was hard to imagine. And so I think that's one thing that once I was working in book publishing, uh, I mean, I was just an editorial assistant, but so sort of learning from my bosses and watching them and getting involved and how do you keep a story going for
Mhm.
300 pages and what are the different demands of a long book, like working on other people's manuscripts that way, even though a lot of them were nonfiction. That's a lot of what I was doing was nonfiction. Still, it had I think that was helpful. And then the other thing was
Mhm.
definitely helpful was just like um, working as an editor is like being a professional reader. So just like tuning, like really fine tuning um, my reader self was
Mhm.
helpful, I think. And just like I think I know that my sentences got sharper during that time because I was like editing other people's sentences, you know. So yeah, I think all that was really useful. I mean, and then at this point, it feels like it's starting to be a long time since I was in that role, but I
Mhm.
think I carry those for sure, carry those skills with me. And I also, as a writer, the way that I write is I like to edit as I write. It's like I write a sentence, then I edit it 10 times, and I write another sentence. So I'm
Really?
almost like an editor and a writer at the same time.
What was the road to publication like for you then? So you're working as an editor,
Mhm.
and then what? How did you
Um,
go from not being able to imagine writing a novel to writing a novel?
yeah, right, right. So I think it was when I was working, I was a editorial assistant still. Um, I went back to my short stories that had been my thesis at Columbia.
Hmm.
And I think I was like, I wonder, because I think I had heard some advice like, oh, maybe you can turn a short story into a novel, or sometimes a short story is the first chapter of a novel, which I don't know how often that it actually is the case. Like, especially now I teach creative writing. I don't know, because they are such different forms, in a way, maybe an unsuccessful short story, that a student writes, maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
because really it should be a novel. Like, I think that's possible. Anyway, so I went back to these old stories, and one of them um, was the story of, it was like 12 pages long, and it was the story of the rotation of the earth suddenly speeding up by 1 hour. So it was like a young girl living in this new world where the rotation, where the days were 23 hours instead of 24 hours. And this time when I looked back at that story, I thought, like, wait, maybe this, like, if I, this might, I suddenly, like, kind of, yeah, sort of suddenly could see how it could maybe be a novel if I made some changes, which is one, I made the rotation of the earth slow down. And
Mm-hmm.
two, I made it be an ongoing crisis instead of like just one time we lost an hour. It was like a gradual slowing and an escalating crisis. So I think it kind of came to me, yeah, sort of suddenly after being away from it, that maybe that could be a novel. So once I had, and that turned out to be The Age of Miracles, but that was like I spent, 3 years or 3.5 years writing a little bit each day in the morning before I came to work. Um, so anyway, that's how I wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of getting it published, I sent it. I also got my first short story published during that time when I was working in book publishing. So it was in Bomb magazine. So I got that story published, and I had about 40 pages of The Age of Miracles. And I was like, oh, maybe I should try to get an agent at this time, because at that time it felt like there was an idea that you could get a 2-book deal, one for the story collection and one for a novel, which I don't know where that stands right at this moment, but I feel like it was kind of going out already, kind of,
Mm-hmm.
it was like a, um, a thing that was becoming less common already at that time. So anyway, but I sent it to a few kind of my dream agents. And one of them, Eric Simonoff, was interested. But he didn't think we should send it out as a story collection and a novel. He said, like, I think you should just finish writing this novel, and then we'll see if we can sell it. So that's what I did. So I met with him, and I was really excited that he was, enthusiastic about about it. But I also was like, okay, I'm just gonna now write this whole book. And so that was like 3 years, 3 years, 3 years of work after getting in touch with Eric. But luckily, he still was enthusiastic when I turned in the whole book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, and then he submitted it, and I did sort of, like, I feel like I had a teacher once who called it like the literary lottery. I feel like I did, with my first book, kind of win the literary lottery in terms of, like, it was smooth and there was a lot of interest and it was really exciting. So yes, that I feel like it's not the norm, but I feel lucky that that happened to me once.
Well, and then once you have your first book that's out there and doing beautifully, and you come back and you sit down to write the second one, was it difficult to get the second one started after that first one, or
I mean, it
what was
did
that
feel
like?
different because I felt like I was writing the first one just kind of out in the wilderness with no idea if I would ever publish it or if anyone would ever read it. Whereas the second one, I was like, well, I think some people are going to read this book, And so that was, like, exciting, obviously, but also a new kind of pressure. So I think there was a bit of a transition of having to kind of, like, try to, get the, like, I don't know, Goodreads reviews out of my head a little. Um, but I mean, mostly it was nice to feel like some people are gonna read this, but it did feel, I think it was a little bit distracting at the beginning. Yeah, and I don't know, I guess even though both of these, my second and third books, have both taken me a lot longer than my first one. I think the longest was The Dreamers, was a little longer than my most recent one, Jane O. So maybe there was something about, like, that transition that made it even longer, but also because I had two babies. I don't
Well, yes. Do you read the Goodreads reviews?
I mean, I think in general, like I will go years, like with my old books, I'll go years without looking, either intentionally and unintentionally. But then when you have a new book, like I can't, I have to, like, especially at the beginning, I have to be like, well, what do readers think?
Yes.
So yeah, so I try to be, intentional about it. But I feel like writing books is an act of communication. It's like I put a communicate piece of a sort of form of communication out in the world. And I know that some readers or some writers have an idea of not reading any reviews, but there's something, I don't know. I've tried to find the balance in the middle. Like, you can't be dominated by your mind can't be dominated as a writer by every little thing that uh, reviewers think, either professional reviewers and Goodreads reviewers. But I think it's strange. It would be strange to have no idea like what people's reading experience would like.
Yeah.
So you know, I try to balance it.
You've said that one of the parts of developing into a writer is being able to imagine yourself reading the book as if it's not yours. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of under discussed element of being a writer, is having to do that. It's like another piece of imagination. Like, we think about, obviously, the imaginative work of coming up with the story and the characters, and um, anyway, that's an obvious piece of imaginative work. But I really do feel like being able to imagine what it's like to be the reader of a story. I mean, what it's like to be the reader of a story that's not yours. But the imaginative work is imagining that you're coming to it cold, um, which you can never fully. It's always going to be a bit imperfect. But I do think it's really an important part of being a writer to be able to, you know, somewhat successfully imagine what it would be like to be reading the book, uh, for someone who didn't write it. Um, and actually, something I didn't say before about being an editor, I think that did help me. Like, being an editor all that time, where I was in that seat of reading someone else's work, it made it maybe a little easier, or developed that skill of, like, okay, just pretend I'm editing this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So, yeah, I do find that to be a really important part, and I do it kind of intentionally. Like, I'm like, what if I picked this up in a bookstore and I read this first page? Like, what would I think, or what would I be wondering? The other thing is, further in, especially a mystery, uh, like, what would I be curious about? What would I be wondering about? What's the objection I'd have in this moment as a reader,
Mhm.
that now as a writer I need to account for.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You now teach, as we've said, in the MFA and undergraduate program at University of Oregon. And you've said that you feel like teaching is a much better day job for you, as a writer than editing was. I'm curious about why that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason is, when you're an editor, your work can really take over all your free time. I mean, because there isn't time, or at least in my experience, and witnessing. Like, I was a very kind of junior level editor, but witnessing the higher ups too. It's very hard to find time to edit during the work week, because you're busy with meetings and doing all these, like, office work, and talking to agents and your colleagues, and helping
Mm.
with, helping decide what the cover should be, whatever. There's all that work to do. So, it's hard to find the time to edit during the work week. And so weekends become a very natural, weekends or nights, or get up early. Those become like natural times to do editing work. But then I think even more than that is, the submission process, the reading submissions, because then you really have, like, let's say a novel comes in on a Friday. Like, sometimes you need to, if you think you might be interested in it, you need to give some time over the weekend, because some other editor is going to, and so by Monday someone else might make an offer. I mean, that doesn't always
Mhm.
happen, but there is this, like, time pressure. So, yeah, so I guess that it just felt like there is this way that's a job that, I mean, I think it's, you have to either you have to love it or you have to be like really and figure out how to make it work so that it doesn't take over your whole life. But my experience was I could see how that could happen. Whereas teaching, even though there are times when I'm busy, it's more finite, because maybe that's the other thing. It's like it can feel infinite. Like there's just so many submissions coming in all the time. Whereas as a teacher, it's more like, well, I've read the workshop, my students' workshop stories for the week, and I've written the letters, and now I'm done. you know, so
Yeah.
that I think yeah, that's a big reason. And then I mean, it's also I guess both jobs um, can be great for a writer because you're getting to spend your day job immersed in books. That's the good thing about both of them. I think being a teacher, maybe I feel like I'm able to be immersed in the part of the book world that I most like, which is just literally the writing, the sentences, the text, the stories, and I'm not thinking about like, oh, what are the sales figures of this similar book, you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
um, or how should we pitch it to a certain audience. Those kinds of questions are like really important and can be interesting, but they're not my favorites to be
Yeah.
working on. So I'm glad. I feel really lucky to be, yeah, to be teaching, and especially if you, yeah, because it's also part of my job to like it's sort of my books are my research, like so.
Mhm.
And my publication, like so it's actually part of my job, so there is some time set aside for it's meant to be for me to do my work. So that's also
Yeah.
a big difference. If
Yeah.
I was an editor, that would be not the case.
What do you know now that you wish you had known before publishing that first novel?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I mean, it's a good question. Hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I have a great answer to it. I mean, what do I wish I had known? I mean, maybe I would have been, this is so specific, but I would have been glad to know, just specific to me, it would have been nice to know that I was going to get to keep publishing books after that. Because I think from working in book publishing, I knew that, books, it's just really hard to get attention for any one book in general. And even a
Mhm.
book that there's like a certain amount of excitement around it, like it can still like, disappear in a way. Um, and so I just was obsessed with this idea of like, what if it is like a huge, like it really doesn't sell well and like, or no one pays any attention to it. Like, what if this is the last book I ever get to publish, So maybe that I don't, but that's not so helpful. And in terms of like advice or something that I wish I knew, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a great answer, but that I would have liked to know that I was going to get to keep publishing books.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite piece of advice for aspiring authors?
Um, I mean, I think the main thing that I say, which is also not so original, but I think really is key, is just to read as much as possible. I think, and
Mm.
especially well, I guess in two categories. One, read as much as you can in what you want to like in read as many books as you can that are like, in some way in the same space that you want to write or doing
Mhm.
something similar. But also remember to read things that are not what you would normally pick up, because I feel like I've had
Mhm.
definitely had a lot of like some kind of breakthroughs in my own work have come because someone recommended a book that I maybe wouldn't have thought to read, or I read it for a class. Um,
Mhm.
and so yeah, I think, yeah, read the things that you're gonna, as many as possible, like the kinds of short stories or the kinds of novels that you would expect to like and that you're interested in already. But also be on the lookout for the ones that don't sound like they're going to be up your alley right away.
I think that's great advice. We have a traditional last question
Okay.
podcast, and it is when the strange case of Jane O is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh, wow, that's a hard question. You know, I think I will say one but it's um I think not possible in what, if this book ever gets made
That's
into,
okay.
it can't be this one because that's already been a very evocative theme song to a different movie. But the song that I listen to a lot, and I intentionally listen to it, to kind of like get the vibe I wanted was
Mm.
The Mystery of Love by Sufjan Stevens.
Mm.
Just very like it's I mean it is like a kind of a love story vibe, but it's very mysterious. It has this super like ethereal, mysterious quality to it.
Oh.
And it was I think the main theme song or in all the trailers for Call Me by Your Name. That's
Ah.
why I say if I were lucky enough for this book this to be made into a movie, in a few years, they can't use that song because it's already
Well, it
been.
can be on the soundtrack though.
Yes, right. But I did purposely listen to it. Like I would think to get into the vibe of, this like kind of ethereal, mysterious vibe that I
Ah,
wanted the book to have.
very cool. Karen Thompson Walker, thank you so, so much for being here today. It is such a treat to get to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.